Vice President J.D. Vance just delivered a devastating, career-altering blow directly to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's face during a high-stakes congressional budget hearing, ruthlessly reading aloud a damning internal document her own campaign staff had written a highly sensitive communication. They never anticipated anyone outside her fiercely protected inner circle would ever lay eyes on. By the precise moment the vice president finished reading the incriminating words, the notoriously vocal Congresswoman had completely stopped talking. She did not attempt to execute a seasoned political pivot, and she did not attempt to deflect the monumental scrutiny. She simply froze, utterly failing to answer a single pressing question regarding her campaign's exorbitant, deeply hypocritical spending habits. I want to be clear about what's happening in this room today. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had confidently stated earlier in the proceeding, sitting with one elbow resting casually on the polished mahogany committee table, her chin tilted upward at a microscopic yet unmistakable angle of pure defiance that was too small to measure but far too large to miss. The American people are not stupid, she had declared, projecting unwavering moral authority, asserting that the Republican-led hearing concerning the massive economic footprint of the Green New Deal was driven not by genuine budgetary concerns, but by sheer, unadulterated terror. They are afraid of a generation that is demanding change, she proclaimed, deliberately holding the final, echoing word a fraction of a second longer than the others, much like a seasoned vocalist holds a concluding note to ensure the entire room fundamentally understands the phrasing was an intentional, powerful choice. She confidently added the ultimate proclamation, and I am here today because I have never been afraid of their questions. Yet, mere moments after explicitly boasting to the Budget Committee about her absolute fearlessness in the face of rigorous oversight, the vice president sat squarely before her, weaponizing her own campaign finance filings that lay completely bare on the desk between them. The meticulously documented FEC records detailed a staggering $53,000 exclusively allocated for luxury five-star hotels, alongside premium first-class airfare and exorbitant celebrity makeup services, every single cent of it funded by grassroots donor money. Vance appeared entirely in his element, operating with lethal precision. His sleeves were methodically rolled to the forearm, stripped of the formalities of a jacket and tie, projecting an aura of grounded reality. His glasses rested casually on the bridge of his nose as he scrutinized the formidable, devastating stack of papers before him. He possessed the cold, focused demeanor of a veteran mechanic examining a routine work order, already acutely aware of exactly where the catastrophic engine failure lay, merely verifying the mileage before delivering the fatal diagnosis. "Thank you, Congresswoman," Vance initiated, his tone dangerously calm and completely devoid of theatrical outrage. "I'm going to ask you some questions about numbers. Not values, not aspirations. Just math. I'm happy to discuss math." Mr. Vice President Ocasio-Cortez countered swiftly, completely unaware of the trap that had just snapped shut. "Good," Vance replied, effortlessly extracting the initial page from the dense evidentiary stack. "The Green New Deal. You introduced it. You're its primary sponsor. You've said it represents the defining policy challenge of our generation." He leaned in slightly, effectively cornering her with her own past remarks. "In 2020, you stated publicly, and I'm quoting, that it costs us zero if passed because it is a non-binding resolution of values." Peering sharply over the thin rims of his glasses, he repeated the impossible, fabricated figure that formed the bedrock of her political revolution. Zero. She held her defensive ground, rigidly stating, "That is accurate in the context in which I said it. A non-binding resolution does not carry appropriations." Vance immediately pressed the offensive, acknowledging her desperate technicality, but methodically dissecting the looming economic reality, right? The resolution costs zero. But the things it calls for, net zero emissions by 2050, a federal jobs guarantee, guaranteed health care, guaranteed housing, a full rebuild of national infrastructure, those cost something, you agree? Of course, implementation would require significant investment, she conceded, the political ground rapidly shrinking beneath her. Vance struck immediately. What's the number? The ensuing silence was suffocatingly palpable. In the second row of the press gallery, a veteran reporter abruptly halted, writing mid-word, the tip of their pen frozen permanently against the notebook paper. Completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, the exact cost depends on the scope of implementation, which would be determined by subsequent legislation. She deflected, frantically retreating to standard bureaucratic talking points. Vance did not yield a single inch of territory. What's the number, Congresswoman? He reiterated his voice, a steady drumbeat of accountability. There is no single number because the Green New Deal is a framework, she insisted, desperately attempting to maintain the rapidly crumbling high ground. Vance then deployed the devastating independent statistic that shattered the illusion. The American Action Forum estimated $93 trillion over 10 years. Do you dispute that estimate? She immediately attacked the credibility of the messenger rather than the math. That is a bad faith estimate produced by a conservative think tank designed to Vance cut cleanly through the political rhetoric with surgical, brutal precision. Do you have a better one? Her mouth closed, then opened. The agonizing, microscopic gap between those two involuntary movements lasted perhaps a second, maybe slightly less, but the frozen pen in the press row remained entirely motionless, capturing a career-defining implosion. A woman seated in the public gallery leaned intensely forward in her seat, captivated by the spectacle. And somewhere above the imposing dais, the climate control system clicked off, cycling back on again with a mechanical hum. In that suffocating half-second void between the two mechanical sounds, there was absolute, terrifying nothingness. Ocasio-Cortez's trembling fingers desperately sought the glass stem of her water. She lifted it to her lips and drank, deliberately extending the action for precisely the excruciating duration required to formulate a coherent, defensive sentence within her panicked mind, while desperately projecting the illusion of mere physical thirst. When she finally lowered the glass, leaving an ignored, damning wet ring upon the polished mahogany table that she entirely refused to look at, she reiterated her flimsy defense. The cost, she stated, would be determined by the specific legislative vehicles that carry out the framework's goals. That is how policy works. You don't price a framework, you price the legislation that implements it. Vance effortlessly summarized the glaring, fundamental discrepancy of her entire political existence. So, you have built your career on a policy you call the defining challenge of our generation, and you don't have a cost estimate. He slowly removed his glasses, deliberately placing them atop the imposing stack of financial documents. Congresswoman, I grew up in a house where my mother couldn't keep the lights on. He began stripping away the artificial veneer of political theater to expose a brutal working class reality she only cosplayed. Not metaphorically. The electric company shut them off. And in that house, before you bought anything, a winter coat, a gallon of milk, you knew what it cost. You knew because if you didn't know, you didn't eat that week. Replacing his glasses, he delivered the inescapable indictment. You are asking the American people to buy the most expensive thing anyone has ever proposed in the history of this country, and you don't know what it costs. You have never sat down and done the math. In my neighborhood, Congresswoman, we call that a wish. A seasoned political journalist in the press row partially closed his laptop, abandoning it entirely as the glowing screen cast a haunting, thin blue light across the underside of his jawline. Ocasio-Cortez leaned aggressively forward, her elbows anchoring her to the table as her hands tightly clasped before the microphone. When she furiously retaliated, her vowels were sharply clipped, her consonants striking like literal weapons, every meticulously crafted sentence targeting the exact same midsection like a disciplined, cornered boxer desperately working the body before attempting a knockout blow to the head. Mr. Vice President, I find it interesting that we are suddenly very concerned about costs. She fired back, her voice dripping with weaponized indignation. I didn't hear this level of concern when your administration passed $2 trillion in tax cuts that went overwhelmingly to the wealthiest Americans. She continued building her desperate rhetorical barricade. I didn't hear it when we spent trillions on wars that your party voted for and then voted to extend. I didn't hear it when this body approved subsidies for oil companies that are posting record profits. She allowed the furious list to build each heavily rehearsed item serving as yet another defensive brick in a towering wall she was hastily constructing between herself and the monumental question she had fundamentally failed to answer. The cost concern appears as if on cue when we start talking about clean energy and healthcare and jobs for working people. And it disappears also as if on cue when we talk about corporate tax breaks and defense contracts and bailouts for banks. She declared, aiming for a viral soundbite, that is not fiscal responsibility, Mr. Vice President. That is selective math. And the American people can see the selection. Directly behind her, a deeply anxious staffer nervously uncrossed her legs and aggressively crossed them the other way, while frantic, continuous note-taking resumed across the energized press row. A Democratic aide lurking desperately at the rear of the chamber typed furiously on his smartphone, the device's small blue glow reflecting ominously in his lenses as panic set in. Vance absorbed the theatrical barrage, nodding rhythmically, keeping the nod going. The nodding persisted exactly one agonizing beat past the natural stopping point, eerily reminiscent of a seasoned mechanic patiently listening to a frantic customer insist their vehicle is running perfectly fine, all while the mechanic has already observed the massive, undeniable pool of oil permanently staining the driveway. You're right that both parties have spent irresponsibly, Vance conceded coldly, instantly deflating her entire counteroffensive. I won't sit here and pretend otherwise. He casually lifted a completely different page from the imposing stack. But I can tell you exactly what the tax cuts cost. The CBO scored at $2 trillion over 10 years. You can argue about whether it was worth it, and reasonable people will disagree, but there is a number. 93 trillion is a number. 0 is a number. What you have, Congresswoman, is a policy with no number. You're asking working families to sign a blank check. She immediately rejected the devastating framing. That is a mischaracterization. It's arithmetic. Vance shot back instantly, slamming the door on the debate. The flurry of pens in the press row abruptly ceased once again, the room plunging back into terrified anticipation. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted drastically, growing instantly toxic for the Congresswoman as Vance purposefully reached for a secondary, ominously thinner stack of papers, distinctive in their different color, systematically squaring the edges directly in front of him, much like a ruthless casino dealer preparing to deal a losing hand. I want to talk about your spending, Congresswoman, not the country's spending. Yours, he stated, his voice devoid of any remaining warmth. Her chin elevated a defensive quarter of an inch. My personal finances are not the subject of this hearing, she protested, sensing the impending slaughter. Your campaign finances are public record, ma'am. I read the FEC filings. Anybody can, Vance corrected effortlessly, dismantling her shield. He smoothly unfolded the topmost page, grasping it with the intense, patient familiarity of a heavily guarded receipt carried in a wallet for years for a very specific reason, intimately aware of its contents and merely waiting for the perfect adversary to finally present it to. In 2025, your campaign spent over $53,000 on luxury hotels, he announced to the dead silent room. He recited each opulent destination with a flat, clinical specificity mirroring an apathetic customer service representative reading back a mundane list of overcharged grocery items. The Langham Huntington in Pasadena, the Vidara Hotel and Spa in Las Vegas, the Lansdowne Resort in Virginia. He deliberately placed the damning document onto the dark wood, smoothing the crisp paper exactly once with 2 fingers. Campaign travel requires lodging. That is standard operating procedure. She countered weakly, desperately attempting to normalize the staggering luxury. For nearly $50,000 in Puerto Rico in a single reporting period, Vance questioned sharply, instantly pulling the subsequent page from his loaded arsenal. Luxury catering, a $23,000 venue rental at the same arena where you were photographed in a luxury suite during a concert. He continued relentlessly, positioning the second page immaculately beside the first, and first-class airfare alongside Senator Sanders for your Fight Oligarchy tour. He stopped completely. He let go of the explosive page. Looking up slowly over the thin rims of his glasses, he planted both hands firmly and flatly on the table, flanking either side of the evidentiary stack. He remained completely frozen in that commanding posture for 1 agonizing beat, then 2 lasting just long enough for the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of the phrase to travel from the front of the cavernous room to the very back, arriving violently at every single seat along the way. Fight oligarchy, first class. Somewhere deep within the public gallery, an unseen man exhaled sharply through his nose, a cynical, short, sharp sound signifying the bitter taste of an entirely expected yet deeply disappointing reality, like biting into something rotten that tastes exactly the way they expected it to. Vance relentlessly continued the assault, extracting yet another page. Your campaign paid $670 to a celebrity makeup artist, not a local freelancer, not someone's cousin with a kit, the personal makeup artist for Bad Bunny, he stated, laying the extravagant receipt down. And in 2021, the House Ethics Committee found Congresswoman not alleged, not suggested, not raised concerns about, found that you violated congressional gift rules at the Met Gala, where you wore a custom designer gown that said tax the rich in front of people who had paid $35,000 a ticket to eat dinner with you. He commenced arranging the explosive documents into a precise, undeniable timeline across the committee table. His movements were agonizingly slow and deliberate. The exorbitant hotel invoices placed leftmost in strict chronological order, followed closely by the premium flight records, then the damning ethics committee ruling, and finally the astronomical makeup receipt. He positioned each piece of paper with the meticulous, dreadful care of a host, arranging fine place settings at a table where someone tremendously important is about to sit. Together, the documents formed a stark, undeniable row of white rectangles contrasting sharply against the dark mahogany. And the row possessed a definitive direction, a trajectory pointing directly like a loaded weapon toward the woman seated at the other end of the table. 7 devastating pages, 7 white rectangles. A direct line of undeniable financial hypocrisy that ended squarely at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You told the country to tax the rich, Congresswoman. You wore it on a dress. And then you took campaign donations from working people who sent you $27 because they believed in what the dress said. And you spent their money on 5-star hotels and first-class seats and celebrity makeup. Vance articulated, methodically dismantling her entire carefully curated progressive image. He slowly removed his glasses, holding them firmly in one hand, and that hand absolutely did not move. I grew up watching my mother choose between the electric bill and the grocery bill. That wasn't a talking point, that was a Tuesday. And I'm sitting here looking at your receipts, and what I see is a person who has turned other people's poverty into a brand and then used the donations those people sent her to live like the people she says she's fighting. A woman seated in the fourth row nervously clasped both hands tightly in her lap, her eyes cast downward, paralyzed by the raw, unvarnished intensity of the confrontation, completely unable to break her posture. Tax the rich on a designer dress at a $35,000 dinner, Vance summarized brutally, twisting the knife. First class on a fight oligarchy tour, $670 for celebrity makeup, all billed to the donors. And her staff reclassified the hotel charges in the FEC filings so nobody would notice. Ocasio-Cortez abruptly sat straighter in her expensive leather chair, her panicked gaze intentionally bypassing Vance entirely to lock directly onto the television cameras, desperate to control the spiraling narrative. I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly. She began, her voice escalating drastically in pitch and tightness, each desperately formulated word arriving with the intense physical force of a person attempting to push open a massively heavy door that refused to yield. What is happening right now in this room is a very wealthy, very powerful white man from Yale University who is married to a corporate attorney who wrote a best-selling book about poverty and then moved to a mansion in Cincinnati, lecturing a working-class woman of color about how she spends money. She frantically framed the targeted oversight as a historical injustice. That is not oversight. That is the oldest story in American politics, and the people watching at home know exactly what it is. A Democratic senator seated 2 chairs down tapped the wooden table exactly once with 2 fingers, a solitary, resonant thud of tribal solidarity that carried heavily through the tense silence. Vance allowed the sound to finish completely. He did not shift his weight in his chair. He did not uncross anything or recross it. He methodically picked up his glasses and replaced them on his face. And when he resumed speaking, his tone was terrifyingly consistent, absolutely unaltered in volume, unhurried in speed, and icy in temperature. The total shocking absence of an emotional escalation where outrage was entirely expected served as its own devastating counterattack. My mother was a drug addict, congresswoman, he stated plainly, his palms resting completely flat and immovably on the desk, refusing to flinch for the remainder of his brutal monologue. She's in recovery now, and I'm proud of her. But when I was a kid, she was using, and we moved houses a dozen times before I turned 12. And there were nights I slept on a couch that belonged to someone I'd never met in a house that smelled like cigarettes and cleaning products. And that was the stability I had. That was the good version. He stopped, drawing a deep, audible breath that commanded the room's absolute, terrified attention. I went to Yale Law School. You're right about that. I got there because a woman named Bonnie Blanton Vance, Mamaw, took me in when my mother couldn't keep me safe. She raised me in a house in Middletown, Ohio, where the carpet had stains that had been there since before I was born. And the screen door had a spring that didn't catch and banged shut 3 times every time someone walked through it. His voice painted an inescapable portrait of genuine Appalachian struggle. She made me do my homework at the kitchen table every night with a glass of sweet tea and a look on her face that said I would finish it or I would not survive the evening. He paused again, navigating the visceral memories. Mama had a foul mouth. She would not want me to clean that up. But she also had rules. And the first rule was, you do not lie about what things cost. You do not pretend a thing is free when someone is going to have to pay for it. The vice president leaned directly into the undeniable reality of his heritage. You want to talk about working class? Mama made $11 an hour at the end of her career. She worked at Armco Steel until her body couldn't do it anymore. And then she worked part-time jobs, and none of them paid well. And she never, once in her life, stayed in a hotel with a spa. Adjusted for inflation, her best wage was about $15 an hour. Your Met Gala dress cost more to rent than Mama made in a month. His hands had not moved a fraction of an inch. His voice remained an unyielding force of nature. Mama would have looked at that dress, "Tax the Rich," written on a gown at a party full of millionaires, and she would have said something in language I can't use in this building. But the clean version is, that woman thinks we're stupid. The Democratic senator's hand remained completely frozen on the table, precisely where it had previously tapped, entirely unwilling to tap again, his index finger curling slightly inward in a subconscious, desperate attempt to make the hand appear smaller without physically retreating from its exposed position. The receipts on this table don't have a race or a gender, Congresswoman Vance declared ruthlessly, dismantling her last remaining defense mechanism. They have dollar amounts, and dollar amounts don't care who's reading them. Reaching stealthily beneath the formidable stack, Vance withdrew one final, utterly devastating document, holding it aloft without even needing to read the text. This is an internal communication between two senior staffers on your campaign. It was provided to this committee by a former employee. As he read the explosive text aloud, his voice flattened entirely, violently stripping away any trace of Yale polish or regional Louisiana inflection because he wasn't from Louisiana. And Yale was simply a place he attended, not the core of his identity. He was reduced to just a man from Ohio, reciting someone else's deceptive words in a voice stripped bare down to the structural utility of drywall and joint compound. The first staffer writes, "We need to move the hotel line items into a different category before the next filing. The Langham and the Vidara are going to look bad next to the messaging." He paused dramatically, adjusting his glasses with agonizing slowness before reading the catastrophic, career-ending reply. The second staffer responds, "Agreed. Can we split them across events? Call them venue costs." Vance looked up slowly from the fatal page, locking eyes with his political opponent. "It's technically accurate if we held a call from the room." Above the massive wooden dais, the previously unnoticed fluorescent lighting suddenly dominated the suffocating silence. A thin, constant, high-frequency hum that nobody had registered until the sheer weight of the moment amplified it. In the back row of the chamber, someone audibly swallowed, the microscopic, wet click captured by a highly sensitive microphone, transmitted mercilessly through the public speakers and violently dying out. Vance placed the final page deliberately at the absolute end of his meticulously constructed line, expanding the sequence to 8 damning white rectangles, definitively bridging the gap from his side of the table directly to hers. "Technically accurate if we held a call from the room," he repeated, drastically slowing his cadence, replicating the precise manner a person utilizes when repeating a critical sentence. They want the official court reporter to transcribe with absolute, irrefutable perfection every single word in its proper place. That is not a person who didn't know how it looked, Congresswoman. That is a person who knew exactly how it looked and hid it. You didn't accidentally spend working people's money on luxury hotels. You did it, and your staff knew it would look like what it was, and they sat down and figured out how to reclassify it in the filing so nobody would notice. Venue costs, because somebody held a phone call from the room. Ocasio-Cortez's right hand lay flat, rigid, and completely lifeless on the table. Her left hand immediately retreated to the false safety of her lap, vanishing below the committee desk's edge, far out of the camera's unforgiving view line, engaging in a hidden, nervous, desperate interaction with the fabric of her skirt. Her mouth opened, instinctively forming the shape of a defensive word, the frantic beginning of a this, or a thee, but the defense catastrophically collapsed. her mouth simply closed, trapping the unborn word permanently in her throat. The visual of her mouth snapping shut without uttering a single solitary syllable became the absolute quietest sound in the entire room, yet simultaneously the loudest, most deafening event that had occurred all morning. "You told America to tax the rich," Vance summarized brutally, driving the final, undeniable nail into the political coffin. "While your staff was figuring out how to make the filings look like you weren't living like them." Vance adamantly refused to stand, remaining heavily anchored in his chair, completely eschewing the theatrical grandstanding of a slick courtroom lawyer delivering a dramatic summation to a captivated jury. He presented himself merely as a kid from a dark, impoverished house reading an unfathomably wealthy person's luxury hotel bill, and the chair deliberately kept him grounded at that devastatingly authentic level. "I want to say one thing about the Green New Deal, and then I'm done," he stated, his cold eyes locked permanently onto the undeniable paper trail of receipts. The Green New Deal asks working Americans to fundamentally change how they live, how they drive, how they heat their homes, how they feed their families. It asks them to bear the cost of a transition that will reach into every corner of their lives. And the person asking them to bear it, the primary sponsor, the face of the policy, the woman who says, "This is the defining challenge of our generation," cannot tell them what it costs. He systematically dismantled her entire legislative legacy. She has never produced a number. She has never submitted it for a CBO score. She told him it costs zero, and she has let others say it costs $93 trillion, and she has not once, in the years since she introduced it, sat down and done the math. Effortlessly lifting the scandalous hotel receipt between two fingers, he flawlessly juxtaposed her catastrophic failures. But she has done math. She has done the math on the Langham-Huntington. She has done the math on first-class airfare. She has done the math on celebrity makeup. She has done the math on venue rentals in Puerto Rico for herself. His voice hardened with pure, righteous indignation. The math gets done for herself. The math gets done for the American people. The people who sent her $27 donations because they believe the dress for those people. There is no math. There is a slogan, and there is a bill that somebody else is paying. He gently set the extravagant receipt back down, meticulously squaring the stack of evidence before firmly folding his hands together. Mama used to say something. She said, "Watch what people spend money on. Don't listen to what they say. Watch where the money goes." The money tells the truth when the mouth won't. Locking his piercing gaze directly onto Ocasio-Cortez, he delivered his absolute final verdict. "I watched where your money went, Congresswoman. It went to the Vidara Spa. It went to first class. It went to a makeup artist who charges $670 to make a person look like they care about the working class." Removing his glasses and placing them softly on the table directly next to the damning stack, the subtle, metallic click of the hinges resonated like a gunshot through the dead silence. "I'm done." The committee chairman formally inquired if the gentlewoman from New York wished to issue a response, but she merely stared blankly at the unrelenting sequence of documents dividing them: the luxury hotel invoices, the premium flight manifests, the catastrophic ethics ruling, the incriminating staff communication, the falsified FEC filings, a merciless line of white rectangles glowing against the dark wood, an evidentiary trail ending squarely at her defeated posture. "I have dedicated my life," she stammered, the word life fracturing mid-syllable with a fragility so imperceptibly thin it required intense, dedicated concentration to even detect it, to fighting for working people. That is, she faltered, abandoning the thought completely. Her trembling hand instinctively reached to adjust the stationary microphone, despite the fact that the equipment had not moved a millimeter, executing the frantic, pointless movement of a person desperately seeking physical occupation for panicked, empty hands. The characterization of she attempted yet again before completely aborting the defensive sentence. Her jaw clenched so intensely that two rigid, strained lines materialized instantly along her neck, stretching tautly from beneath her ears straight down to the collar of her sharp blazer, resembling high-tension steel cables tested to their absolute breaking point. My record speaks for itself. She managed weakly, surrendering to the inevitable. Vance offered absolutely no retort. The scandalous receipts lay flat and quiet on the committee table between them, functioning as silent, undeniable executioners. The devastating confrontation immediately fractured the internet into two distinct viral shockwaves. The abbreviated 45-second supercut featuring Vance clinically reading the venue costs email, followed immediately by Ocasio-Cortez's agonizingly silent, gaping mouth forming a word that never materialized, obliterated social media algorithms, effortlessly eclipsing 50 million views long before the evening news cycle even began. The unedited, grueling 11-minute marathon video charting the brutal progression from the $93 trillion Green New Deal math straight through to the deeply personal Mama monologue became the exact kind of potent political ammunition ordinary citizens enthusiastically forwarded to one another without a single word of commentary. The naked hyperlink communicated everything necessary. By 4:00 p.m., an entirely obscure graphic designer whom nobody had ever heard of unleashed a ruthless side-by-side image. The infamous Tax the Rich Met gala gown positioned starkly on the left, directly against the exorbitant Vidara hotel invoice on the right. It weaponized the internet, propagating through cyberspace at a speed that utterly dwarfed anything the designer had ever created. Before the close of the business day, the Federal Election Commission dropped the hammer, officially announcing a preliminary, comprehensive review of Ocasio-Cortez's campaign expenditures spanning both the 2024 and 2025 reporting cycles. In a desperate, flailing attempt at damage control, the Congresswoman's panic spokesperson issued a pathetic two-sentence statement that reeked of highly compensated desperation, reading exactly as though it were hastily drafted by a terrified attorney, afforded only 4 minutes, and forced to make a deeply unpleasant phone call they desperately wanted to avoid. The Congresswoman's campaign spending has always been in full compliance with applicable regulations. We are cooperating fully with any and all inquiries, the sterile release claimed. Within the ruthless, transactional ecosystem of Washington politics, cooperating is universally understood as the precise, coded terminology employed by politicians who have just retained elite defense counsel billing at an hourly rate exceeding what Mama earned in an entire week. That very evening, hundreds of miles away from the insulated D.C. swamp, a retired auto worker named Gary sat quietly in his Middletown, Ohio living room, an environment that had remained fundamentally unchanged and unredecorated since the Clinton administration. Gary, a man who personally knew Bonnie Vance from her arduous shifts at Armco Steel and who had once chauffeured young J.D. home from school in a battered pickup truck with a fractured windshield when the boy's struggling mother failed to appear and the frantic school had called around until someone answered, watched the entire 11-minute demolition on his smartphone while resting in his worn recliner. A lifelong, staunch Democrat throughout his entire adult life until the political tectonic shift of 2016, Gary viewed his evolving allegiance not as a betrayal of his core principles, but as a tragic, undeniable realization that his deeply held values had been ruthlessly discarded on the side of the political road by the very elitists falsely claiming to carry them. He consumed the footage twice. The initial viewing was dedicated to absorbing the brutal words. The second was exclusively to study the Congresswoman's devastated face precisely when the undeniable words about the falsified venue costs came out and she utterly failed to summon an answer. He heavily scrutinized her silently opening and closing mouth, instantly recognizing the profound psychological state on full display. It wasn't merely the specific physical gesture, but the universal category of absolute defeat, the unmistakable visage of a person who has been caught dead to rights, is frantically running through non-existent options and is terrifyingly finding none. Lacking a social media footprint and possessing absolutely zero intention of ever acquiring one, Gary didn't share the viral clip. Instead, he placed his phone on the armrest of the recliner and stared thoughtfully across the room at a faded, framed 1,974 photograph of his cherished Union Hall. The image captured resilient men standing proudly with hard hats in their hands, squinting against the harsh Ohio sunmen who had bled through the exact same grueling shifts for 30 years, retiring with modest pensions barely sufficient to buy groceries and heating oil and absolutely nothing else. These men had never experienced the opulent luxury of a hotel with a spa, nor had they ever flown first class in their entire lives. They had simply been told by well-dressed politicians who stared them directly in the eye and said the words out loud that somebody in Washington was actually fighting for them, and they had believed it purely out of desperate necessity, because acknowledging the terrifying alternative that nobody was fighting for anybody was simply too agonizing to bear. Gary deeply pondered the stark, nauseating reality of a glamorous congresswoman who brazenly peddled that identical fighting for working people narrative to the grandchildren of those hardworking union men, only to quietly funnel their hard-earned $27 donations into lavish Las Vegas spas, subsequently ordering her operatives to forge the paperwork so it wouldn't look like exactly what it was. He extinguished the screen of his phone, plunging the house into a heavy, suffocating quiet, interrupted only by the mechanical hum of the kitchen refrigerator and the distant, solitary bark of an unseen dog that quickly faded into the vast, hollow night, leaving a silence that possessed absolutely nothing in it that required filling. Trapped in the suffocating silence of her luxury Washington apartment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat entirely frozen, her smartphone lying face down like a venomous snake. She ignored a relentless barrage of panicked messages from her crisis team, who were frantically drafting increasingly hollow statements to stop the political bleeding. The carefully curated, righteous illusion of her tax-the-rich persona had just violently shattered against the cold, undeniable math of her own elite hypocrisy. Somewhere in the dark of her closet, the infamous designer gown hung entirely stripped of its power, a silent, damning witness to a political brand built on working-class struggles, but lavishly funded by grassroots donor dollars. While she desperately grappled with the fallout of her exposed receipts, premium first-class flights, a $670 celebrity makeup artist, and over $53,000 in five-star hotel bills intentionally disguised in federal filings as mere venue costs, the contrast couldn't be starker. She had demanded working Americans foot the bill for a $93 trillion progressive framework that she initially claimed cost zero, all while her staff meticulously hid her luxurious reality from the very voters who scraped together $27 to support her, miles away. A perfectly calm Vice President J.D. Vance sat in the quiet of the Naval Observatory. He wasn't gloating, making triumphant phone calls, or scrambling for social media spin. He simply took a pen and inscribed a single lethal truth on a yellow legal pad. She never gave them a number. The glamorous political facade has completely crumbled, exposing a monumental blank check built on a fabricated brand, and with the FEC already launching a preliminary review, the walls are rapidly closing in. But the true, devastating fallout of this unprecedented congressional showdown is only just beginning to ripple through Washington. Can her political career actually survive this catastrophic, undeniable exposure, or is the fight oligarchy era definitively over? Subscribe. Drop exactly one word in the comments to share your verdict. Share these undeniable receipts with anyone who still believes the narrative, and brace yourself, because the explosive next chapter is going to change everything.